The morning light over Clarence House was weak, filtered through the heavy silk curtains that had been drawn since the previous evening. Inside, the private residence of Queen Camilla was unusually still. The king was away at Sandringham, and the household staff moved through the corridors with their practiced, silent efficiency. For weeks, Camilla had been mentioning to her private secretary a persistent issue with the climate control in the older section of the building, specifically, and the lack of proper airflow in a space that had, for the last 2 decades, served as her personal dressing room and wardrobe annex. It was a room with a peculiar history, one that had been whispered about in royal circles since 2005. Before Camilla's marriage to the Prince of Wales, it had been a modest bedroom. It was the room Prince Harry had occupied during his teenage years at Clarence House, a sanctuary for a young man navigating the complexities of life after the loss of his mother. When Harry permanently moved into his own quarters and later to Nottingham Cottage, the space became redundant as a bedroom. In the quiet reshuffling of the royal residences that followed his father's remarriage, the room was repurposed. Camilla, who had moved her official residence into Clarence House, required substantial wardrobe space for her increasing public engagements. The small bedroom was converted, its walls fitted with bespoke joinery, its carpets lifted to make way for polished flooring suitable for displaying shoes and accessories. It was a practical decision, but one that would later be etched into royal lore as a point of contention, immortalized in a memoir that spoke of a stepson's resentment at finding his childhood room erased. On this particular morning, the head of maintenance for the royal household, a man named Arthur who had served the crown for over 40 years, arrived with his team. And they were not there to dwell on history. They were there to fix a ventilation grill that had seized up behind a large built-in armoire. The armoire was a magnificent piece of furniture, a Victorian-era wardrobe that Camilla had inherited from the Queen Mother's collection. It was heavy, solid oak, and required 4 men to carefully maneuver it away from the wall. As the massive piece of furniture scraped against the floor, revealing the dust and shadows of decades past, one of the younger workmen, a lad named Tom, let out a low whistle. Behind where the armoire had stood for so long, the wall was not the smooth painted plaster they expected. Instead, there was a seam, a faint vertical line in the wood paneling that was almost invisible to the untrained eye. Arthur knelt down, running his fingers along the edge. It was a door, perfectly flush with the wall, its handle cleverly concealed within the ornate molding. "Well, I'll be," Arthur muttered, and in all his years, he had never noticed it. The plans for Clarence House, which he had studied extensively, did not show this space. It was as if the room itself had been designed to keep a secret. He gently pushed against the wood. It didn't budge. It was locked. News of the discovery traveled quickly up the chain of command. Within the hour, Camilla's private secretary was on the scene, accompanied by a senior member of the Royal Collection Trust. The lock was old, and a complex Chubb mechanism that looked like it belonged to a different century. A locksmith was summoned from Buckingham Palace, a specialist who dealt with the historic security of the royal residences. The atmosphere in the corridor grew thick with anticipation. What could possibly be behind a sealed door in the Queen's private dressing room? When the lock finally clicked open with a sound that echoed off the high ceilings, Arthur was the first to step forward. He pushed the door inward, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into a darkness that smelled of aged paper, lavender, and beeswax. The air was cool and still, as if it hadn't been disturbed in half a century. They descended one by one, the workmen carrying portable lights. The staircase opened into a small, vaulted room. It wasn't a dungeon or a panic room, as some of the more imaginative staff had speculated. It was a storage room, but not for general household items. It was a time capsule, and the first thing that caught the light was the gleam of white satin. There, hanging on a padded mannequin in the center of the room, protected by a layer of fine muslin, was a dress. But not just any dress. It was a gown of breathtaking construction, heavy duchesse satin, intricately embroidered with a latticework of pearls and crystals. Beside it, on a separate stand, was a robe of crimson velvet, its edges thick with ermine fur that still held its luster. Tom, the young workman, stared in awe. And even in the dim light, the significance was unmistakable. They were looking at the coronation attire of Queen Elizabeth II. The discovery sent a jolt through the Royal Collection Trust. Curators and historians were dispatched immediately. As they carefully began to inventory the room, the full scope of the find became clear. This was not just a discarded dress. It was the complete ensemble worn by the young queen on June 2, 1953. The coronation dress, designed by Sir Norman Hartnell, was a masterpiece of British fashion and symbolism. It was embroidered with the floral emblems of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth, the Tudor rose of England, the Scottish thistle, the Welsh leek, the Irish shamrock, and the Canadian maple leaf, all rendered in shimmering crystals and seed pearls. The curators handled it with reverence, noting that despite the passing of over 70 years, the fabric was remarkably preserved, the threads still strong. The robe, the Parliament robe, it was equally magnificent. Made of purple velvet and lined with ermine, it was a garment of immense weight and historical significance, worn by the sovereign for the state opening of Parliament, and, most importantly, for the moment of coronation. To find it here, in a hidden closet behind Camilla's armoire, raised 1,000 questions. Why wasn't it with the rest of the crown jewels, or the royal ceremonial dress collection at Kensington Palace? As the day progressed, the discovery deepened. On a low shelf beneath the dress, carefully boxed in acid-free tissue that predated modern conservation standards, was the coronation jewelry. Not the crown jewels themselves, but the personal pieces the queen had worn. There was the coronation necklace, a stunning diamond choker made for Queen Victoria, and the matching earrings. Beside them lay the Nizam of Hyderabad necklace, a breathtaking gift of diamonds and emeralds given to the then Princess Elizabeth as a wedding present. And the collection of heirlooms was staggering. But the most emotional find was yet to come. Tucked away in a leather portfolio was a collection of letters. They were handwritten, some on Buckingham Palace letterhead, others on delicate, floral stationery. The handwriting was unmistakably that of the late Queen. The letters were addressed to Darry, the nickname for the Dowager Duchess of Abercorn, one of Queen Elizabeth II's most trusted and oldest friends. The correspondence spanned decades, from the 1950s to the 2010s. They spoke of the pressures of monarchy, the joy of her grandchildren, and the quiet moments of grief she carried for her sister, Princess Margaret. But one letter, dated just weeks after the coronation, caught the curator's eye. In it, the young queen wrote of the ceremony itself. She described the weight of St. Edward's crown, the moment the Archbishop of Canterbury placed it upon her head, and how she had felt the eyes of her father, the late King George VI, the Dao, watching her from the beyond. She mentioned, almost as a footnote, that she had kept her coronation attire close to her for a while. She wrote that having it nearby, in a quiet space where she could visit it privately, helped her to process the enormity of what had happened. She hadn't wanted it immediately consigned to a museum vault or an exhibition case. She wanted to keep it, just for a while. Yes, in a place where she could touch the satin and remember the day she had promised her life to the service of her people. The letter implied that this room had been her private sanctuary. It was never meant to be a permanent storage facility. It was a personal archive. Over the years, as the Queen moved between residences, the location of this secret room may have simply been forgotten. When the royal collection moved items, they followed catalogs and inventories. And if an item was never officially deaccessioned or recatalogued as being stored in a particular location, it could easily become a ghost, existing only on paper. As Queen Camilla's staff continued to clear the room, they found more. There was the ivory silk train held by the maids of honor, carefully folded. There were the sketches and fabric swatches that Norman Hartnell had submitted for the Queen's approval, marked with her handwritten notes in pencil. There were even the shoes, dyed to match the dress, still showing the faint impression of the feet of a 25-year-old woman who had carried the hopes of a nation recovering from war on her shoulders. The news of the discovery, of course, could not be contained forever. When it finally leaked to the press, the world reacted with a mixture of wonder and nostalgia. The image of a young Queen Elizabeth ascending the throne was juxtaposed with the reality of finding her sacred garments hidden behind a closet door. And for many, it was a poignant metaphor for the monarchy itself, ancient, magnificent, but often hidden from view, residing in the quiet, forgotten spaces of grand old buildings. For Queen Camilla, the discovery was deeply personal. She was, after all, the one who had opened the door, albeit inadvertently. The room she had used for her wardrobe for years had been hiding the most significant relics of her predecessor's life. It was a moment loaded with symbolic weight. The woman who had been the other woman in the breakdown of Charles and Diana's marriage was now the custodian, even temporarily, of the sanctified garments of the Queen who had given that marriage her blessing. Camilla reportedly handled the situation with characteristic pragmatism and grace. She immediately contacted the king, who was said to be deeply moved by the find. Together, they decided that these items, having rested in the quiet darkness for so long, deserved to see the light. And the Royal Collection Trust began the painstaking process of conservation and authentication. In the weeks that followed, the hidden room became the most talked-about place in the United Kingdom. Experts from around the world flew in to examine the textiles, the papers, and the jewelry. The letters were carefully read and archived, offering historians a new, intimate glimpse into the private thoughts of Elizabeth II. They revealed a woman who was not just a stoic figurehead, but a daughter, a mother, and a friend who found comfort in the tangible objects of her most sacred day. The story of the discovery also brought a quiet, reflective closure to the public's understanding of the transition from the Second Elizabethan age to the reign of King Charles III. It was as if the late Queen had left a final gift for her daughter-in-law, a secret to be found when the time was right. By prying open that closet, Camilla had not just found old clothes, and she had rediscovered a piece of the nation's soul, hidden away for safekeeping by the very woman who had worn it. The young workman, Tom, would later recount the story to his grandchildren, telling them about the day he helped move a wardrobe and found a queen's forgotten legacy. And Arthur, the old maintenance man, simply smiled, knowing that the old palaces he had cared for all his life still held mysteries that could humble even the most experienced of royal servants. The coronation attire, now carefully catalogued and destined for a place of honor in a future exhibition at Buckingham Palace, had finally emerged from the shadows, ready to tell its story to a new generation.